Greetings and welcome to this edition of
Positronic episode.
I'm Barry P. Cook, and I'm here to talk to you about the latest episode of Star Trek Strange New World. It was called Charades. And as the episode begins, we're hearing a personal log of Nurse Chapel as Enterprise approaches the Vulcan system to investigate a long-abandoned settlement on a Vulcan moon once populated by a race called Kirkovians from Kirkovia. It has Kirk in it. Okay. We find that Spock has been able to get his emotions in check and is avoiding Chapel since he lost his shit last week when she almost died. He learns that upon arriving on Vulcan to visit his fiancée, he will be engaging in the Vulcan equivalent of the human engagement dinner, as arranged by his future mother-in-law, who doesn't approve of their union, but is going along with it apparently. He then is tasked with piloting a shuttle to observe something related to the Enterprise mission on his way to Vulcan, and also to bring Nurse Chapel with him to help with the observations. During the flight, Chapel confronts him about his seeming avoidance of her, but he plays dumb. Upon running some scans as part of the mission, Spock finds a vortex that is some kind of disruption in space-time, and the shuttle soon finds its way to being sucked into it. Next thing Spock knows, he's waking up at sickbay to find that he was injured in the shuttlecraft accident and restored to full health by the Kirkovians, but that whatever they did to him made him completely human. La'an and Una give the shuttle the once-over, and it turns out that whoever found it after the crash restored it and gave it a deep cleaning while also leaving behind a device that allows them to make contact. When they make contact, they reach a non-corporeal being of extreme logic called Yellow, which explains that they made Spock human by saying that he didn't match Chapel and his instructions were mixed, so they made him match her before cutting off communication, which cannot be restored. Meanwhile, Spock goes back on normal duty in his current, very volatile, emotional human state. He also resumes his social activities, which include cooking with the captain, during which he discovers the great smell of bacon and eats a bunch of it, which of course is a very not Vulcan thing to do since it's animal flesh. He also almost punches out Sam Kirk over the fact that he's been leaving crumbs on the table after briefings. Chapel feels really badly about what happened to Spock, and she's burning the midnight oil trying to figure out how to turn him back to the way he was. She then has a very terse interview with a Vulcan administrator from the program she's applying to. After the interview, she encounters Spock in the hallway, and he's very sympathetic and gives her a very awkward hug. Spock then has to rush off to the transporter room to meet with his mother, who's beamed aboard, and he does so wearing an Enterprise-branded toboggan hat to cover his human ears. She tells him that they have to have the engagement dinner the next night because it's already been moved several times since the accident, and T'Pring's family is losing it. Spock gets so stressed over it that he flips out at his mother, at which point she realizes that something's wrong and asks him to take off his hat. This leads to his mother, upon the discovery of his being completely human, to teach him how to lie, so that with the additional help of some prosthetic ears, he can pretend to be Vulcan for the dinner and the complex and very specific rituals that it involves. Turns out that one of the rituals is a mind meld, which Spock is absolutely not going to be able to pull off a faking of. Chapel decides that she has to get the Kirkovians to fix Spock, which would involve contacting them from a shuttle piloted by Ortegas. T'Pring beams aboard, and Spock is supposed to explain to her what's been happening, but he doesn't because she's clearly uneasy about the potential for something going wrong and her mother calling off the engagement, and he doesn't want to add to her stress. Then T'Pring's parents beam aboard, and her mother starts crapping all over everything, while her father seems to be very emotional for a Vulcan. Chapel, Ortegas, and Uhura head into the anomaly in a shuttle because it's the only way they can even try to get a signal to the aliens. As part of these rituals, Spock has to touch a scalding hot Vulcan teapot, which would not normally burn a Vulcan, but is, of course, very hot to his now human hands, even though they definitely could have given him something for that, so I was a little confused by that. Anyway, inside the anomaly, things get weird, as apparently that's where the ladies encounter interdimensional space and another non-corporeal being called the Blue, who says that their complaint about Spock has been lodged after the complaint period. Spock must now endure the ritual where his fiance's parents tell him about all the ways in which he could improve, after which Spock says that he needs to use the bathroom, prompting T'Pring's mother to say that a Vulcan should have a more resilient bladder, and of course, when he gets to the bathroom, he flips out. Chapel gets very emotional trying to get the aliens to help Spock upon learning that Spock diverted the shields to her side of the shuttle to protect her from the accident and left himself exposed to harm. Fortunately, Chapel shows up in the nick of time before the mind meld ritual and injects Spock with something that turns him back into a Vulcan. But not before they have a very heartbreaking moment where she stops him just short of expressing his feelings for her, leaving them unspoken, and thus the situation less complicated, as it were, even though she sort of expressed hers for him. Spock is then able to pull off the ritual correctly, and when, before leaving, T'Pring's mother explains that she's impressed with how he handled everything despite his handicap because a human could never have pulled it off. He lets the cat out of the bag and explains that he was, in fact, human during all of it up to the mind melt. Chapel is then denied entry into the program she wants to get into, but when she's told that she can reapply if she wants, she explains basically that she doesn't need them because she's a badass who encountered an interdimensional species that neither humans nor Vulcans have encountered in a very long time and convinced them to help her, and that their program just isn't ready for her before abruptly hanging up on the Vulcan guy. Spock and his mother take their leave of each other before he visits with Chapel to tell her that he and T'Pring are taking time apart, which is happening because T'Pring got mad that he didn't tell her what was happening, even though he did it to spare her. He tells Chapel that he has feelings for her and that he doesn't want to suppress them anymore now that he and T'Pring are taking time apart, and they get it on. Before the end credits, we actually get a preview of next week's episode, which, by the way, looks crazy cool, and which I'm going to do a separate video about. So if it gets blocked, it won't end up blocking my review of this episode. But it's funny because last week I was saying that, I really wish they'd give us a preview of the next episode at the end of each episode like they used to do in the old days of TV, because as it stood before this week, they would let a preview out in the intervening week, but not at the end of the episode. And that annoyed the crap out of me. It's like, okay, the episode's over. I want to see a preview of next week right now, which they weren't doing, but now here they are. And it's almost like they heard me, which of course they didn't. So that's funny. Anyway, I really liked this episode. And I already know people are going to shit on it, but I really liked it. I really like this show. There have been 14 episodes so far, if I'm not mistaken, and they've all had great stories, with one or two exceptions, maybe. And I think the showrunners and writers have created a great bunch of characters. I think they're doing a good job with the legacy characters, despite the fact that they've made some decisions with Spock that I think are difficult to align with the Spock we know from the original series. Even with the caveat that, well, he's younger and he's not the same guy. He's not that guy yet. But if there were no original series to compare this show to, the list of reservations I had about the show, which mostly involved him and other canon discrepancies, would be completely wiped away. And this show would be a 9 or a 10 out of 10 every week, with, again, maybe one or two exceptions that would be slightly lower. This is a fantastic television show. It is a fantastic Star Trek show. And this episode it knocked it out of the park. It was a tour de force for Ethan Peck. It had humor, it had heart, it had tension. It was entirely relatable because, there are all kinds of traditions and rituals in real life that various ethnicities surround marriage and engagement with. And not only do some families have issues with the fiancés or intendeds of their children from outside of that same ethnicity, but also from within it. And so, these things that Spock was going through are things that happen in real life. And so I thought, it just was very exemplary of part of the human condition, which Star Trek is always supposed to do. And like I said, it had a lot of heart in addition to the humor and other emotional intensity. And the heart was in the form of Spock demonstrating his feelings not only for Chapel, but also for T'Pring, whom he's fond of and cares about, as well as his mother, which of course we know is a very important relationship to Spock and always has been. And I just really enjoyed that aspect of it, as well as the aspect of Chapel being put through her emotional paces as it involves Spock, whom she is desperately in love with. And the moment where the aliens reveal to her that he protected her by transferring the shields, it really chokes her up, and it choked me up. And That's what Star Trek is supposed to do. That's what good television is supposed to do. It is supposed to move you. And this moved me. And it wasn't just that, it was the other characterizations. Ortegas is great in this episode, even though she's only in it for a couple of minutes. Same for Uhura. The Doctor is great. Pike is great in trying to help Spock navigate this situation without letting the cat out of the bag. He just behaves in ways that are valiant and funny, and it just shows how much he cares about Spock. And Anson Mount is just fantastic in the part, which we knew, and that continued to show through in this episode. The special effects were again top notch, especially during the scene when Ortegas, Uhura, and Chapel are in the interdimensional space and talking with Blue and Yellow, which, by the way, make green, which is the color of Spock's blood. But I don't think that was intentional necessarily. Anyway, the special effects in that scene were unbelievable. So, this is just a fantastic show. And, some people might say, well, you can't say if we didn't have TOS to compare it to, because we do. And therefore, it has issues and, it needs to be worked on and fixed and improved because of that. And what I'm going to say now is that we now have reason to not have to do any of that, because without coming right out and saying it specifically, they have come just about out and said it specifically by saying that they have deliberately made changes to the fictional Star Trek timeline by moving up, or I should say moving back, the events of the Eugenics Wars and World War III and the rise of Khan. And the reason they gave for that is nonsensical to me, and I'm going to do another video on it because there's a lot to talk about with regard to it. But the short version is that because they have deliberately made changes to Trek's fictional history, they have in fact set all of new Trek in a different timeline from the original series, the animated series, TNG, DS9, Voyager, and Enterprise. And it just cannot be denied anymore that these events, this show and on Discovery and all of New Trek, do in fact take place in a different timeline from the original series. It's just a fact now because of the changes that they've admitted to making. And on the one hand, I'm not happy about it because I think the reason they did it is ridiculous. Like I said, I'm going to get into that in a separate video. But the fact that they did it frees all of us up to regard these new shows as being as good as they are, despite what would otherwise be canon conflicts. And I say these shows, not counting in their Discovery, which is just terrible, not counting the first two seasons of Picard, which were terrible, but everything else. So Lower Decks, Prodigy, and Strange New Worlds. Anyway, this was a fantastic episode. The acting was great. The effects were great. The writing was great. It moved me greatly. And I loved every second of it. So that's really all I have to say. I'm going to get out of here for now. I'll be back to review next week's very exciting episode, or seemingly very exciting episode, once it's released. Until I return, I wish you peace and long life.